So we're gonna talk about the regenerative wisdom of Femthogenic consciousness. I am delighted to be invited by Janet on this day. I am delighted in how this event and this day has been collectively curated by us all, and I'm delighted that we are addressing something that really matters at this point in time. My talk will be about the input of the archetypal feminine in connection with expanded states and how these two incredible forces can inform our way forward and our current state of chaos and disintegration. And they can be hope and resource, but also a reminder that, as Chris very well said, the journey forward isn't necessarily going to get easier, but at least we can find some solace when the journey ahead becomes somehow meaningful. So we're going to talk about the archetypal feminine. We're going to talk about the infectiousness of alienation and how our individual worlds, our social worlds, and our environmental worlds are in constant dialogue, and that dialogue has become fairly destructive at this point in time. We're going to talk about the war on femthogenic consciousness by our current systems and our current structures. I will try to open up the idea of femthogenic consciousness and explore the points of intersection between feminine consciousness and expanded states of consciousness. And I will talk about that word a little bit more later on. And I wish to close with the anima mundi. I wish to close with nature at the center, and it couldn't be any other way. I don't think there's a wiser force that we need to draw from and attend to at this given moment in time. So I will bring us back to our panel and keep this for a little bit later. So we're here today because we've been reached by a truly unprecedented crisis, and this is a crisis that has affected our everyday lives. It has really stalled the ways we do things. It has really disrupted our rhythms and our movements. And most importantly, it has really shattered our illusion of control, our illusion of safety, certainty, and our illusion of permanence, which is an illusion that has been very detrimental to how we interact with the world around us. Of course, this is a crisis that, again, as Chris said, has been building over a long time and will continue to build over a long time. But it has now become somehow collectively impossible to ignore, because through COVID, it has reached us in a very dynamic way. Our current crisis really has evolved out of our systemic disconnection and alienation from the very vital sources of life, from the rhythms and the cycles of nature. And here I'm talking about nature within and nature without. They are very much a reflection of one another. And from the systemic transgenerational trauma that we're all bearing as a result of this disconnection. We're in dire need of frameworks that can support a process of healing and a process of remembering and a process of reconnection to these vital forces of life. And we're being faced by questions that require a lot of creativity, a lot of deconditioning, and a lot of vision in order to find ways to grapple with them and in order to find ways to somehow address these great questions. So the questions I have been sitting with lately is, how can we build bridges that connect the world on the inside with the world on the outside, that create healthy, vibrant dialogue between these two worlds? How can we remember and restore our true place within the wider whole that we are an absolutely intrinsic part of? How can we return to our deepest belonging to the natural order that's around us? How can we restore our regenerative capacities as a species? How can we face and process our collective wounds and the subsequent shadow that emerges out of these wounds? I believe that what we're currently witnessing in the collective whole is really a need and a call to remember the feminine consciousness back into how we exist and how we operate in this planet, in our lives, in relation to ourselves, in relation to each other. The crisis is really a call back to our deepest, truest nature. In-depth psychotherapy, a symptom is never the illness, and it's never just part of an illness. It is just as much a healing movement. So a symptom is really a messenger that attempts to bring our attention to a one-sidedness that needs addressing, or to an imbalance that requires restoring. And it is an invitation, and often a difficult initiation into a state of greater wholeness. It is a reminder that something requires attention and something requires tending to. So it's an ally in many ways, if we can learn to meet it and engage with it in such a way. I have been interested in the potential of feminine and expanded consciousness as potential ways for addressing our deepest wounds, for encountering our shadow and the wounds our shadow feeds from, for reconnecting to our ancestral roots. And that includes our ancestral wounds, and that includes our ancestral resources. So it's pain and resource in terms of the lineage and the stories and the traumas that we have emerged through and from, for healing deeply. And I started researching the common links between the feminine and expanded states of consciousness. And in doing so, I was coming across a shared wisdom between the two. And of course, it's impossible to open feminine and expanded states and not find nature right at the core of it. This is really the unifying principle between the two. The points of connection between these two incredibly vital and powerful forces of wisdom and life are also the very points of their suppression, because their points of connection and suppression entail a consciousness, entail a wisdom, entail an ethos, really, that goes against our Western systems, our Western values, and our Western current ideologies. So I will be using the term femtheogenic consciousness for describing the shared wisdom and the shared space. And I want to open up the word firstly so that we're on the same page. So femtheogenic or femtheogens is a compound word. It holds two words, the feminine and entheogens. Entheogens, the feminine, we don't quite know what it is, but we have a sense of what it is. And entheogens is another word for psychedelics. It refers to the capacity of a psychedelic experience to awake the divine within. It refers to the spiritual dimension of the psychedelic experience that I think Chris very well talks about. So femtheogenic refers to the capacity of the psychedelic experience to restore and revive the sacred feminine into our consciousness. The feminine that entheogenic experiences revive, of course, is not a gendered and it's not a personal feminine. The feminine that femtheogenic consciousness revives is the archetypal feminine. As part of the collective layers of the unconscious, the archetypal feminine is a psychic construct, an entity that belongs to our soul, whether we're men or women. anything that emerges from the collective belongs to the collective and affects the collective and relates to the collective. So it operates on a much wider scope than the personal realm. So if we think about the personal feminine, then we would be talking about our mothers, our sisters, our grandmothers. But if we talk about the archetypal feminine, then we talk about the great mother, the great sisterhood, the great goddess. So we're talking about a level that has a much greater force and charge than the personal domain. So I want to start by briefly sketching out what archetypes are. And this is a very two-dimensional sketch out. The three-dimensional sketch out has a lot more complexity, but we'll just do a little diagram so that, again, we're on the same page and we follow the same threads. So archetypes are inherited psychic entities or inherited psychic constructs that are deeply buried within the collective layers of our unconscious. And they serve as primal inner maps or primal inner blueprints of the human experience. If you like, they are our collective human inheritance of the human experience. And again, as Chris said very well, they're not set in a form that never changes. As we move through humanity and as we move through our human experiences, and as we evolve, these archetypal forms evolve with us. So the primary function of archetypes is to act as messengers. So archetypes primarily express themselves spontaneously, either through symbols, images, or metaphors. And the primal function is to serve as messengers of the deepest soul. They bring information from the collective layers of our unconscious into consciousness, and they help us integrate this and support our psychospiritual growth, development, and again, they move us towards wholeness. Wholeness is really the synthesis of conscious and unconscious self. It comes from incorporating our undercurrent worlds into consciousness. So the feminine archetype is not a monolithic entity. She's extremely varied and she's extremely multifaceted. And as all archetypes, she exists in a spectrum. On the positive end of the spectrum, she embraces the regenerative and nourishing quality she has. And then on the negative end of the spectrum, we find her devouring capacities. But again, there's complexity, because her devouring capacities, if they lead to further growth and transformation, then they belong to the positive end of her spectrum. The negative end of the spectrum is the devouring aspect that doesn't breed more life, that leads to futility and hopelessness. So the archetypal feminine, as all archetypes, is always present. She speaks to us individually, she speaks to us collectively. Her guidance and wisdom is always there. But as we have collectively forgotten what her true essence is, what she represents, how she manifests, we have lost our capacity to recognize her and really utilize her input on a personal level, on a collective level. We have suppressed the feminine archetypal energies, both within men and within women, and we have failed to take notice of the ways it can support and inform our presence on this planet. We have lost our connection to her elementary rhythms, to her cyclical force and nature, to her ancient mystery traditions, and we have reduced her great depths to a very flat version of womanhood today. The fundamental qualities of the feminine archetype are her cyclical nature, her relational acknowledgement of interconnectedness and interdependence, and her intuitive wisdom. Now, the feminine has always been linked with nature in her archetypal state, and of course that's not surprising, because woman magic and earth magic are closely linked. They both create and they both nourish life. They both support the impersonal goals of life on earth, which is species preservation and survival. the feminine link to motherhood and nourishment is absolutely key for us for understanding her deepest quality, her deepest offering, and her deepest essence. The archetypal feminine gestates deep primal secrets of creation deep within her body. She's able to conceive the potential of life and give birth to it. And in doing so, she participates in the great mystery of life on earth. The incredible mystery is the capacity to manifest the soul into material form. In this mystery, the feminine really participates in the process of creation and regeneration. And it is that link to regeneration that makes the archetypal feminine really central for our collective healing processes. The intuitive wisdom of the archetypal feminine emerges from her connection to a knowing that belongs to the very deep inner worlds. The feminine there is able to access that knowledge because of her surrendering, her yielding, her responsive, her playful, and her non-rational qualities. She is part of the cyclical movements of nature, and in that she embraces chaos and its regenerative capacities, the regenerative capacities of chaos for rebirth and for subsequent evolution, as we will see later. So for our early ancestors, at first that link between feminine and nature was a great point of worship, but gradually man tried to control, suppress, and manipulate both. And in doing so, he created a really deep imbalance in his relationship with the fundamental forces of life. The essence of the archetypal feminine represents spaces that can be ecstatic and fascinating, but they can also be disorienting and frightening. And as a result, as a society, we've learned to avoid, resist, ignore, and unfortunately suppress the spaces that the archetypal feminine represents. But when an archetype has been neglected and devalued, then its remit and terrain become restricted to the deep unconscious. That's the only place they're left to operate from. In the rational, scientific, capitalist, and individualistic world, we have created and surrounded ourselves with the archetypal feminine, and its eroded essence is only left to operate from the deepest realms of the collective unconscious. This is really where her work can go on undisturbed. She reaches us through dreams, meditation, holotropic breathwork, expanded states of consciousness. And even though her work here can go undisturbed, because we've lost our connection with her, again, it can remain really difficult to decipher, really difficult to utilize, really difficult to receive, because the feminine communicates through an archaic, symbolic, and fluid language, the language of symbols and images and dreams and imagination. And in our culture, we have overvalued the rational language, the masculine principle of language. We have valued the rational and ordered container of experience. It is in the realms beyond that space that we find the archetypal feminine. And here we can meet what is beyond words and what is beyond immediate perception. As Chris said, something that takes time to engage with, decipher, and integrate. Of course, what we're currently witnessing in the wider whole is not about the absence of the feminine, because the feminine or the masculine can never be absent. They are the fundamental energies of the entire planet, of the entire universe, not planet. Unfortunately, what we're witnessing is the distortion of the feminine that has exaggerated the tragic imbalance between these two fundamental forces of life, the masculine and the feminine archetype. This imbalance is undermining our civilization, and it's bringing us near to a possible collapse and possible extinction. Through our disconnected intellect, we have raped the earth we live on. We have disrupted the intricate balance of this magnificent planet that we are extremely lucky to be part of. We have created phallic missiles of mass disruption, and we have disguised the impotence of patriarchy that expresses itself in genocidal behavior. If humanity is to move forward, it is essential that we recall and integrate whatever human capacity has remained underdeveloped and delegated to our collective shadow. Instead of consistently relying on an overdeveloped one-sidedness, which is how we're currently operating, we really need to look for the feminine qualities that are dormant potential in all of us. I think here that we will really find treasures that are long lost and forgotten. And these are the secret medicines that we have all longed for, whether we're on this side of the divide or that side of the divide or the other side of the other the divide. We have to come to recognize that we all thirst for the same medicines and the same resolutions. This is why I feel that the restoration of the feminine and the psychedelic experience are both deeply spiritual and deeply political matters. And I think they bridge the two. They bridge the inner with the outer. And they are political matters because they call on us to take our place fully in the responsibility and the consequence of it all. And they lay it bare for us to witness and engage with. Shall I? Yeah. Let me put, let me see if I can put a screenshot. No, I won't be able to. It will get too messy. So, if we fail to recover the wisdom of our interconnectedness that the feminine essence and expanded states of consciousness carry forward and support, then our current sociopolitical, environmental, and spiritual wasteland will only deepen, and it's already deep enough. On an individual level, well, on a collective personal level, we have neglected our hearts and we have deprived ourselves from the sanctuary of community, from the sanctuary of relationships. We are a deeply relational species and we have forgotten how to do relationship. In this internal and external state of alienation, it is really not surprising that we give in more and more to diseases of the mind, diseases of the body, and of course diseases of the spirit. But nothing exists in isolation, as femtheogenic consciousness knows and teaches us all too well. And that means that our individual crises translate to a horrifying social crisis. In our target-driven societies, we have forgotten how to care for ourselves, how to forgotten how to care for others. And our current gods and deities are no longer spiritual, they're monetary. We're facing a really significant immigration crisis, overpopulation, and really tragic issues such as hunger, water shortages, sanitation issues, the spread of infectious diseases, and I mean, COVID is one thing that has been an everyday reality in many places of the world. And these are things that we do not address as societies. We do not have the maturity and responsibility to really address the gravity of these situations. I'll just make a parenthesis here. The systemic thought says that a system is as resilient and as strong as its weakest links. And that means that the weakest links are not negligible. The weakest links are really where care and attention needs to be directed at the most. But we seem to be on a trajectory where we're trying to eliminate the weakest links and pretend that they're no longer there. But in the realm of oneness, these weekend slings are really an expression of how resilient our systems are. So our individual and social crisis also extends to the ecology around us. We have ravaged our rainforests, we have overfished and depleted our seas, we have contaminated our rivers, we have excavated our mountains, we have enslaved and actively participated in the extinction of many species, and our ever-increasing demands for food and technology are depleting Earth's vital resources. Our exploitation of Earth and its resources, of course, is amounting to ecocide, as we're irreversibly disrupting ecosystems that species depend on. And our ecocidal tendencies are linked with our genocidal tendencies, because we're then waging wars on the basis of diminishing resources. So this is an extremely destructive loop we have entered. This is a loop that's aligned with death and not with life. So the collective trauma and grief that has given rise to this crisis is truly unfathomable and repressed. And we seem to go about our daily lives skimming the surface, giving into our addictions, distracting ourselves with screen time and shopping, and really engaging with the superficiality of it all. But the surface has been disrupted by COVID. We can no longer depend on our surface in the same way. And this is a truly precious opportunity to address the deeper systemic and ecological matters that are screaming for us to pay closer attention. The hope, and the only hope for me, is that a moment of crisis is always a potential moment of transformation. We have to face the darkness before the old solidified ego boundaries can be shattered, and through the cracks the possibility of something new may emerge. We have to face and process our collective shadow. We have to face and process the deeper systemic causes and wounds that manifest in endless crisis. And we have to sit and integrate what we come across, what we encounter. Humanity has somehow fallen captive to a great forgetting. We seem to go through cycles of traumatic collective events that come to an end, and then we seem to brush under the carpet, and we don't assimilate what has happened. And because of that, we are all compelled to repeat the trauma. And we are repeating the trauma again and again and again. Because of the great forgetting, we don't seem to be learning. And we have come up against immense resistance from the ossified status quo towards the inevitable collective changes that we're being called to navigate. So as we stand before the thresholds of sociopolitical environmental breakdown, we will need all the resources we can muster. We will need to transcend our structural and self-imposed limitations of otherness, separateness, and isolation. Psychedelic and expanded states really allow us a unique glimpse into our personal and collective shadow. And they unearth what has been lost or hidden in a place that holds peril alongside opportunity. And they can return us to a wisdom that, as I said before, we all deeply thirst for. So in the realms of feminine and expanded consciousness, we can retrieve the medicines of interconnectedness, fertility, regeneration, embodied wisdom, filling, kinship, and belonging. If all these forces return to a world today, a very deep restructuring would take place. So I will move to the war on femtheogenic consciousness. I will start by saying that the feminine throughout time has been suppressed by the words and the myths we have held her in. Myths and language are extremely powerful societal constructs. And I won't have time to go into the words, but I will start with the myth of the Garden of Eden. So in the Garden of Eden, Eve took a bite from the apple from the sacred tree of knowledge. I think this is an extremely important myth for our humanity. This was a mythos that, in the way it has been translated and disseminated, it repressed both the feminine and expanded awareness into sin within our consciousness and merged them with the shadow side. This was the point where humanity fell into duality. Up until that point, the badness was somewhere out there. It was carried by a snake, but from that point onwards, humanity got wrapped in it. And we fell in a paradox that had no solution. We were either in the garden or out of the garden. Now, mythologically and symbolically, this was the onset point of ego development for our species, because to leave the garden, it meant to become aware, and that is self-aware. Had we remained in the garden, we would have remained merged in the unconscious Eden. We left the garden, we developed ego consciousness, and as Chris said, we became determined to hold on to it. So in our predominantly ego-driven reality, we still keep the feminine and expanded awareness into exile. We systematically maintain their inferiority, and we remain really suspicious of their incredible depth and potential. We have distorted both to a diabolical form, and we represent them as dangerous and seductive forces. But the primordial temptress and the evil snake were separated in our consciousness from what they and the apple really stood for, and that's the potential for transformation. That's the potential for evolution. Femtheogenic consciousness has been suppressed by our patriarchal, colonial, extractive, and capitalist structures, and these are really just expressions of one another. They're all operating from a very paranoid state of consciousness that tries to suppress any potential for power or anything that threatens its structures. And they are what has waged the war on femtheogenic consciousness. These systems thrive by creating and maintaining unjust power relations, by creating and maintaining inequalities. They teach us to think that our value as a person is linked to our place in the system, and they fool us into believing that we actually are who we appear to be or who they tell us to be. But while patriarchy has actively waged a war against the feminine and against expanded states of consciousness, we have to be very clear that today it's not perpetuated by men only. Patriarchy's attack of the feminine is a collective wound and responsibility today. The devaluing of the feminine has damaged the feminine within men, and it has damaged the feminine within women, as we all hold a part of that archetype in our psychic depths. And unfortunately today we're all part of a culture that attacks the feminine and attacks nature in all of us. This means that we all have to delve really deep within ourselves and really ask ourselves where we have played our own part in distorting, devaluing, or repressing her true vital essence in the personal world and in the archetypal world. Having lost our knowledge and our connection to her ancient teachings, her incredible wisdom, we have really deprived ourselves from our connection with the most unifying principle of creation. Today's children of the patriarchy do not know the goddess. We have misunderstood her potential and the power of her very links to the fabric of life. Patriarchy, of course, has also been in conflict with psychedelics. Patriarchy does not seem to tolerate psychedelics, and psychedelics do not seem to tolerate patriarchy. Patriarchy has traditionally favored substances that maintain boundaries, create a mindless state, and support the status quo. Tobacco, sugar, caffeine, alcohol are really significant here, and then screens have come in later generations, and Terence McKenna has written about the link between the ban on entheogens, the suppression of the sacred feminine, and the rise of patriarchy. I suggest you consider his work. Now, entheogenic experiences and psychedelic states deliver us to the land of ambiguity and paradox, and they have a way to cut through our cultural conditioning and offer us a much wider lens to really consider consensus reality, or what we call reality. They catalyze imagination, and they catalyze the expansion of our consciousness, and they tend to allow us to consider possibilities that are more planet and more people friendly. But very, very importantly, through their links with the archetypal feminine, they reawaken and filter her essence through to us. They revive her regenerative and restorative capacities into consciousness, and this is really significant. Now, entheogenic experiences usually make the maintenance of rigid hierarchies unsustainable, and that has posed a major threat to patriarchy. Patriarchy has done an excellent job at responding to that threat by making us believe that the use of psychedelic agents is an immoral and an antisocial threat. And they have validated the criminal persecution of cognitive liberty, which is the freedom to expand or enhance our consciousness in ways that we see fit. Two minds always about the, let me see if I can bring at least the femtheogenic links in view. Is that visible?
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. So the feminine is psychedelic in a very deep sense. She shares entheogenic qualities that can heal, transform, and support the expansion of our consciousness. So in mapping out the links, then we also get nearer to see and understand what these two sources of life can retrieve for us if their force and potential is assimilated and harnessed by our species in service of our collective development, maturity, and growth. So one of the major insights of femtheogenic consciousness is the awareness of connectedness and oneness. We have been caught into the illusion of separateness for centuries. That's better. We have been caught in the illusion of separateness for centuries, and this is an illusion that has alienated us from Earth, from Earth, from each other, and from the deepest nature of our own selves. We have forgotten that nature is not out there. We have forgotten that nature is actually what we're made of. And we no longer see the natural world and order as sacred. We have changed that. We now see the natural world and order as a set of hierarchical relationships with our species in the dominator's position. And that has made us enter a narcissistic bubble. And from that narcissistic bubble, all we can witness in the mirror of the world around us is our own needs and ourselves. We have somehow come to believe that our needs entitle us to control and manipulate all natural resources. And of course, that has created a crisis that's environmental, it's social, and it's spiritual. But the femtheogenic message is very clear. It talks about our interconnected interdependence. The oneness that femtheogenic consciousness speaks about is a spiritual connection, of course. It speaks about the connections we all have with each other and the wider universe. We're all mirrors of our shared humanity on a species level, and we all hold each other within ourselves. But that oneness is not just a metaphysical idea. It's what chaos theorists have called the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flaps its wings on one continent and weeks later creates a hurricane in another continent. So this is the oneness we see in the effects of industrialization, deforestation, the impact of the consuming grid of the West on the East. It is a very real and direct way of experiencing the world around us. And lately I have been pondering on the word oneness, and during an exercise where I embodied oneness, the body seemed to want to go backwards and surrender into a fairly passive, blissful state, where I felt unified with everything and merged. However, I think the oneness that requires our attention at this given moment in history requires more of us. And this is where the concept of reciprocity comes in for me. If I think of reciprocity from that state of oneness, then the body moves forward and extends. It comes in conscious engagement, and we need to engage with our oneness in a very conscious, reciprocal way at this point of history, at this point in time. This very small move seems extremely significant. So I will be mapping out the femtheogenic themes, and then the feminine, and then the expanded state. So in terms of oneness, I mean, deep feminine consciousness is by nature aware that everything is connected. This is a knowledge that the archetypal feminine has carried deep within her embodied centers of creation, where all life has emerged and regenerated from. The archetypal feminine has incubated, birthed, and weaved our ancestral lines into existence. She is a bearer of these threads of singularity. Equally, in the infinite realms of expanded states and entheogenic journeys, we're being shown the threads that hold us all together in the wider whole. We are being shown the absolute connectedness and interdependence that permeates the whole universe. At that invisible space of oneness and singularity that femtheogenic consciousness opens us up to, at its core has Eros. And to encounter this is to awaken to the most powerful force in the entire universe. So the next femtheogenic consciousness link is boundary dissolving experiences. Now, as I said earlier, our societies have been based on divisive boundaries that maintain the illusion of separateness. And the ultimate and the most dreaded boundary to cross is the disillusion of the ego. Now, the ego has been a big part of our evolution, and as a concept in itself, it can have many useful functions. It is the very thing that maintains a continuity between past, present, and future. It holds a thread itself. What is dysfunctional is our persistent need to hold on to it. Because the ego needs to undergo many deaths if we are to transform into a more authentic version of who we of ourselves. We need to peel through the layers to get through to the core of who we really are. Feminine consciousness is based on the elementary experience of boundary disillusion, which is motherhood, where the other is contained totally within oneself. And that's not just a physical oneness and boundary disillusion, because this is a symbiotic bond that extends way beyond the birthing process. Entheogenic experiences are also based on the disillusion of boundaries on various levels. In these experiences, the divisive lines between past, present, and future, us and other, feeling and thinking, mind and body, masculine and feminine, they all dissolve. And that is the most threatening aspect of expanded consciousness for individuals and for the general status quo. But this is where femtheogenic consciousness delivers us to, a point where in order to evolve and transform, we need to transcend our own boundaries and release our false values and release our false sense of self. The next femtheogenic consciousness link relates to chaos. So we have battled for generations to tame chaos because we have always perceived it to be one of our greatest survival threats. It's not always been like that. The early Gnostics and the early alchemists really recognized chaos as a really vital part of the process of transformation. But today we relate to it as a state of disintegration rather than a stage of transformation. We have failed to acknowledge the inherent order that is contained in chaos because its order is creative, it's not linear. Its order has to emerge, it cannot be imposed. In its fields reside the rhythms of matter and the deeper wisdom of the creative and regenerative process. Chaos is a vital part of the regenerative forces, of the regenerative forces and process, and this is exactly where we have landed in this given historical moment in time. The archetypal feminine, as we saw earlier, has a creative link with the regenerative aspects of chaos that she attains through her surrendering, yielding, instinctive, and capacities, and her capacity for authentic presence, her watery fluid qualities in the archetypal form. Through her deeper and embodied knowing of the cyclical natures of the cyclical wisdom of nature, the archetypal feminine knows very well that chaos is really important. Phantogenic journeys embrace chaos and the transformative potential that it carries forward for us. And they teach us that chaos is a very valued stage in our unfolding process of becoming. So during a deep phantogenic journey, we're taken apart and then put back together. So we start from order that gives way to chaos, that reforms in a new order that is of greater complexity than before. So it's a step further in our evolutionary journey. A big part of what has eroded our connection with nature, our connection with the feminine, and our connection with phantogenic journeys underground is our collective difficulty to be with chaos. And phantogenic consciousness holds the potential for reviving that relationship in a very meaningful way. The next phantogenic link relates to the vital cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Now, for our ancestors, the feminine powers of fertility and birth were a symbol of the cycles they show in the nature. When the season moved, when the life cycles of the plants and the animals moved, and they learned from nature that death is a stage of regeneration rather than an end in and of itself. Today, we relate to death with dread. We are unable to face its vital essence, its vital place, its vital wisdom, and COVID has really brought that to the surface. And we are immersed in an all-encompassing war and denial of it. I'm looking at Meg and I will say I will invoke the archetypal goddess Kali in this space and her wisdom for the regenerative forces of chaos. The goddess Kali is a very powerful feminine archetype and symbol of that regenerative wisdom. And she teaches us that the goddess that gives life is the goddess that takes life. Creation gives place to destruction. Destruction that is in service to life gives place to creation. So the goddess Kali is in constant movement, and all aspects of life or death are equal, if not one. She is indifferent to our ego's demands for survival. We can only recover our deep inner treasures by facing and meeting the dark side of the archetypal feminine, the devourer and the transformer. And it is the same with entheogenic experiences. The most impactful entheogenic experiences are those that unfold into the psychospiritual experience of ego death. Femtheogenic consciousness allows us to flee our ego, if only for a second, and receive a wisdom that welcomes and even necessitates death. Now, that doesn't mean that in our mortal lives, death, loss, and transition are not very painful portals, because they truly are. That is to also access a wisdom that teaches us it is the ego that grieves. On a soul level, every end is just a drop in a really vast ocean. The next femtheogenic link relates to time. Now, time is a major symbol in our societies, and we treat it as a fixed and static construct. But the feminine rhythms of regeneration reveal timelessness. The archetypal goddess of birth contains a soul that moves through various birth canals. She participates in a mystery that intersects time. It goes beyond time. Entheogenic spaces also operate on that, from that knowing of timelessness, because they allow us to move through past, present, and future again, as Chris exemplified in the most incredible ways. So through femtheogenic consciousness, we come to witness, experience, and relate to a very different sense of time. The next femtheogenic link is creativity. Patriarchy has suppressed our creative forces by focusing on the logic and the mind. But femtheogenic consciousness really supports the creative dimension of our evolution. The archetypal feminine is the creative matrix for our species. She's holding within her body the patterns that belong to creation. Entheogenic journeys are highly creative spaces. They speak to us through symbols, visions, metaphors, that connect us to that which is beyond words or beyond immediate perception. But our societies have not really acknowledged the creative and ultimately healing potential of these states. And creativity and healing are much nearer than we acknowledge. And we have only learned to treat them as chaotic, destructive, and very dangerous states. The next femtheogenic consciousness link is on femtheogenic knowing. So femtheogenic consciousness carries a particular kind of knowing that our societies have long neglected and suppressed. Femtheogenic knowing is embodied, it's intuitive, it's non-linear, and it's informed by the creative source. It reveals to us the invisible, and that, of course, includes the invisible corners of our psyche. Now, this is very important because this is where our shadow lives. Being able to claim our shadow and its wounding can help us cultivate compassion for ourselves and in reflection for others. This is where we come to meet the limitations of our human condition. And this is where the heart works on compassion and forgiveness. The divides of black and white here fuse into the grey. So the absolute divides of us and them no longer can stand, because we come to see that we're all one. We all hold the same wounds. We all hold the same shadow on a collective level. So here we start to work on integration. Femtheogenic consciousness opens us up to spontaneous, instinctual, and authentic ways of living. So in trying to shield ourselves from our impermanence and lack of control, we've learned to perceive the world and reality as concrete. This has offered us some safety, but it can also lead to staleness and deadness, which is ironically the very thing we've tried to avoid in the first place. We operate from a state of doing, unable to tolerate a state of being. But the true essence of the archetypal feminine exists in a fluidity that is full of potential, and it is not bounded by rules or order. Entheogens too, by dissolving our egos and allowing us to die and rebirth infinite times within the space of a few hours, they shake away our social masks and they help us question the unquestionable. Femtheogenic consciousness embraces change and impermanence, and these are the foundational basis of evolutionary drives. Who we can become under the guidance of Femtheogenic knowing can be far wider and broader than what the stagnant matrix can ever allow us to imagine. The final femtheogenic link I will discuss is the unconscious. So in the symbolic world of Jungian analytical psychology, consciousness is represented by the masculine and the unconscious is the terrain of the feminine. The fluid, creative and symbolic qualities of the archetypal feminine and her capacity to penetrate to her deep inner walls is what gives her such unique access to our unconscious psyche, and she communicates these spaces through to us through dreams, imagination, and expanded states of consciousness. Anthogenic journeys also bring our undercurrent realms into the surface of consciousness, and they allow us to get a better view of what lays hidden in this darkness. Femtheogenic openings into this very deep, hidden, often shrouded from awareness places can create the potential for conscious and unconscious to meet, which, as we said earlier, is the potential for wholeness and what the Jungians would call the path for individuation. So the femtheogenic consciousness links are not just conceptual matters. How we relate to them can really recalibrate our moral compass and can redefine how we exist in the world internally and externally. They can support our collective healing and transformation, but for that to really happen, we have to retrieve and invoke the true and deeper essence from our unconscious. And I will finish with Anima Mundi. So for our ancestors, nature was the great mother. She was powerful and she was vital. This was the earliest collective blueprint humanity had on the nature of God. As the sun god replaced the earth goddess, we lost our connection to nature and we became alienated from this profound source of life and wisdom. That divine source of creation, the soul of the world, was known as Anima Mundi. Anima Mundi held the knowledge that there is consciousness within matter. Anima Mundi was the spirit that resides within the center of every living thing. And it held the knowing that everything is animate, alive, and therefore everything is capable of being in relationship. And our ancestors used sacred ritual to activate the light of the world soul. Ritual has been used extensively by our early ancestors. I'm sort of skipping some things here. And these rituals held a complex emotional connection between our ancestors and the wider cosmological forces of the universe, something we have really lost today. Today, we can only understand Anima Mundi as a concept because we no longer live a life that's aligned to its principles. We have forgotten the world is alive and sentient, and we have forgotten to relate to that light within nature and within ourselves. And we have disconnected with the magic side of the human experience. Meditations, mantras, breathing exercises, entheogenic experiences, they all activate the inner human technology. And they return us to an embodied wisdom, and they can transform an ego consciousness into a soul consciousness. A connection with the Anima Mundi, the world soul, can bring us back into connection with our own soul. There's been a lot of talk about the return of the divine feminine. The return of the divine feminine is essentially a new mythology for engaging with nature, our planet, and our own bodies, for bringing heart intelligence back into how we operate in the world. The feminine and the masculine are the fundamental creative principles of the universe, and a healthy future needs to be balanced by the divine androgen. Evolution for our species at this point is really a matter of interiority. We need to go within and die a million deaths to our personas, shed a million skills, and every death and rebirth is a sacred initiation for the emergence of a truer self. To enter the core is to awaken the light that lives within the center of every living thing. So to enter the core is to awaken the anima mundi. I will end with a prayer and an invocation, and try to somehow fix this. So we don't know what we're birthing through fully, and we don't know what we're helping to die in this process. This is a knowing that will come under the weight and clarity of hindsight, but we're being called to live in greater harmony with the greater ecosystems we are a part of. And my closing invocation is for this crisis to really be our mirror, guiding us in, guiding us through, and guiding us out into the next stage of evolution for humanity.